The afternoon of the 29th of January 1945 was a crucible of iron and ice. In the Ardennes forest, the Bulge had been neutralized, but the retreating German Wehrmacht remained a wounded and lethal predator. Amidst a blinding blizzard in the Belgian village of Holzheim, the air was thick with the scent of cordite and the oppressive silence of deep snow. Here, First Sergeant Leonard Funk, Jr., acting as the executive officer of Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, would encounter a tactical nightmare that defied every mathematical law of warfare. By late January, the 82nd Airborne Division was engaged in a grueling counteroffensive. Company C was severely under strength. The attrition of winter combat had claimed their officers and thinned their ranks. Funk, a 28-year-old veteran of the Normandy drops and Operation Market Garden, was a man of quiet competence. Though he stood only 5'5", his presence commanded the absolute loyalty of his men. To bolster his dwindling force for the assault on Holzheim, Funk had performed a desperate administrative alchemy. He had rounded up clerks, supply personnel, and cooks, handing them rifles and telling them, "You're all infantry now." After a 15-mile march through waist-deep drifts, Funk's makeshift platoon had cleared 15 houses in a brutal room-to-room struggle. They had captured approximately 80 German prisoners, who were being held in the courtyard of a farmhouse under the guard of a mere 4 American paratroopers. While Funk was finalizing the mopping-up operations in another sector of the village, the tide turned in the farmhouse courtyard. A German patrol, clad in white camouflage capes that rendered them nearly invisible against the snow, infiltrated the perimeter. They overwhelmed the 4 exhausted American guards, forcing them to their knees with hands behind their heads. The 80 prisoners were instantly liberated and rearmed from a pile of discarded weapons. Within minutes, what had been a secure holding area became a staging ground for a counterattack. 90 German soldiers led by a German officer were organizing to strike Company C from the rear. Had they succeeded, the scattered and exhausted American company would have been annihilated in a crossfire. It was at this precise moment that Leonard Funk walked around the corner of the farmhouse. He was alone, performing a routine check on his guards and prisoners. He stopped dead. Before him stood an entire platoon of the enemy, rifles leveled and machine guns being positioned. The German officer, recognizing Funk's rank from the stripes on his sleeve, lunged forward. He shoved the cold steel muzzle of an MP-40 submachine gun directly into Funk's stomach. The officer began to scream a guttural, red-faced command for surrender. Though Funk did not speak a word of German, the universal language of a barrel pressed against the gut required no translation. At this juncture, any rational actor would have complied. The odds were 90-1. Funk was surrounded, outgunned, and at the mercy of a man with his finger on a trigger. Yet, the memory of the Malmedy massacre, the execution of 84 American POWs just weeks prior, loomed large in the minds of the 82nd Airborne. For Funk, surrender was no longer a guarantee of survival. It was merely a different path to the grave. Then, the unthinkable happened. Leonard Funk began to laugh. It started as a chuckle and escalated into a full-bodied roar of amusement. The historical record suggests various origins for this laughter. Perhaps it was a deliberate ruse to sow confusion, or perhaps it was the hysterical sublime, the brain's reaction to the sheer absurdity of the odds. Regardless of the cause, the effect was hypnotic. The German officer, expecting a plea for mercy or a stoic silence, was paralyzed by this breach of military decorum. He screamed louder. Funk laughed harder. Even some of the German soldiers, caught in the surrealism of the moment, began to titter with nervous uncertainty. While his shoulders shook with feigned or genuine mirth, Funk's hands were moving with the lethal precision of a seasoned paratrooper. He slowly reached for his M1A1 Thompson submachine gun, which hung slung over his shoulder. To the German officer, it appeared to be the slow-motion gesture of a man finally relinquishing his weapon in surrender. The moment the Thompson's grip met Funk's palm, the laughter stopped. With a lightning motion, described in his official Medal of Honor citation, Funk swung the muzzle into line and pulled the trigger. The .45 caliber rounds shredded the German officer instantly. Before the officer's body hit the frozen earth, Funk was already pivoting. He swept the courtyard in a lethal arc, the Thompson barking at 600 rounds per minute. "Pick up their weapons," Funk bellowed to his 4 guards. The paratroopers on the ground scrambled for discarded rifles as Funk performed a combat reload, dropping an empty magazine and slamming a fresh 30-round stick into the Thompson in less than 2 seconds. The Germans, leaderless and shocked by the sudden eruption of violence from a man they thought was broken, fell into total disarray. In a firefight that lasted less than 1 minute, the snow of the courtyard turned crimson. 21 German soldiers were killed. 24 were wounded. The remaining 45, terrified by the sheer ferocity of the American sergeant, threw down their arms and raised their hands once more. Funk stood in the center of the carnage, his weapon smoking in the frigid air. He looked at his men and remarked with characteristic understatement, "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen." By his refusal to submit, Leonard Funk had not only saved his own life, but had prevented a catastrophic breakthrough that would have decimated his company. It was an act of conspicuous gallantry that transcended mere bravery, entering the realm of military legend. On the 5th of September 1945, when President Harry Truman draped the Medal of Honor around Funk's neck, he whispered, "I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States." Leonard Funk had faced the impossible math of war, and he had laughed in its face. The mettle of a man is often tempered long before he reaches the battlefield. For Leonard Alfred Funk Jr., the resilience required to face 90 armed men in the snows of Belgium was born in the soot-stained valleys of western Pennsylvania. To understand the hero of Holzheim, one must look back to the Great Depression and the grueling evolution of the American airborne, a journey from a humble clerk to the most decorated paratrooper of the Second World War. Born on the 27th of August, 1916, in Braddock Township, Leonard Funk was a child of the Monongahela River Valley. This was the heart of America's industrial machine, a landscape dominated by the towering smokestacks of the Carnegie Steel Company. Life in a steel town during the early 20th century was defined by grit, repetitive labor, and a communal understanding of hardship. Growing up during the Great Depression, Funk learned the gravity of responsibility far earlier than his peers. As jobs vanished and the economy contracted, he became a primary caregiver for his younger brother, a role that instilled in him a quiet, protective maturity. By the time he graduated from high school in 1934, the prospect of higher education was a luxury the family could not afford. Instead, he entered the workforce as a clerk, a role that demanded meticulous attention to detail and a calm demeanor, traits that would later define his quiet competence in combat. In June 1941, 6 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the shadow of global conflict reached the steel mills. Funk's draft number was called. When he reported to the induction center at Wilkinsburg, the medical examiners saw a man who defied the traditional archetype of a warrior. Standing 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing a mere 140 pounds, Funk looked more suited for a desk in the Quartermaster Corps than the front lines of an infantry assault. However, the diminutive clerk possessed an inner fire that the Army's physical metrics could not capture. He did not merely accept his service. He volunteered for the paratroops. In 1941, the American airborne was an experimental and hazardous concept. To many, jumping from a functional aircraft into enemy territory sounded like a suicidal endeavor. But for men like Funk, the airborne represented the elite, the vanguard of a new kind of warfare. Airborne training was a brutal sieve designed to break the weak. At sites like Camp Blanding and later in the hills of Georgia, Funk underwent a transformation. The regimen included relentless physical conditioning, 5-mile runs up steep terrain, hours of calisthenics, and the jump towers that simulated the terrifying moment of exit. Statistically, nearly half of all volunteers washed out during the first 5 weeks. Funk did not just survive, he thrived. His maturity, a product of his Depression-era upbringing, set him apart from the 19-year-old recruits. He understood that in the airborne, your life depended on the man next to you and the meticulous packing of your chute. When he finally stepped out of a C-47 Skytrain at 1,200 feet, he conquered the primal instinct to hold the doorframe. He earned his silver wings and was assigned to Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, PIR. In late 1943, the 508th PIR shipped to England to join the 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans. This division was already legendary, having fought through the mountains of Sicily and the mud of Italy. Funk was now part of an organization that expected nothing less than perfection. Despite being the new guy, his steadiness quickly earned him a leadership role. At age 27, he was considered ancient by paratrooper standards, but his squad looked to him as a stabilizing force. The true test began in the early hours of the 6th of June 1944. As the C-47 seconds crossed the English Channel toward Normandy, the night sky erupted in flak German anti-aircraft fire. Funk stood in the stick, burdened by 60 pounds of gear. including his Thompson submachine gun and extra ammunition. The drop was chaotic. Clouds and enemy fire scattered the planes, forcing pilots to break formation. Funk jumped into the dark at an altitude of only 400 feet, far too low for a safe deployment. He hit the French soil hard, suffering a severe sprain or fracture to his ankle. In the silence of the night, surrounded by flooded fields and German patrols, Funk was 40 miles from his designated drop zone. Any other man might have sought cover and waited for rescue. Instead, Funk began to walk. Over the next 10 days, despite the agonizing pain in his ankle, he gathered a lost legion of 18 other paratroopers who had been scattered across the countryside. He took the position of lead scout, refusing to let his men take the risk of the point position. He led them through hedgerows and enemy-held hamlets, moving by night and hiding by day. When they finally linked up with Allied lines on June 17, Funk had not lost a single man. This feat of leadership earned him his first Silver Star. The experience in Normandy, followed by the harrowing drops of Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, forged Funk into a master of small unit tactics. He learned that in the chaos of airborne operations, the math of the battlefield was often irrelevant. Survival depended on speed, aggression, and the ability to think clearly when the world was exploding around you. By the time the 508th was called to hold the line in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Leonard Funk was no longer just a clerk from Pennsylvania. He was a first sergeant and acting executive officer, a man who had seen the worst of the war and remained unbroken. He had watched friends die in the snow and had heard the whispers of the atrocities at Malmedy. This was the man who would walk around the corner of a farmhouse in Holzheim on the 29th of January 1945. The steel mills of Braddock had given him the grit, the army had given him the training, and the combat in France and Holland had given him the resolve. When the German officer pressed a gun to his stomach, he wasn't looking at a victim, he was looking at a man who had been prepared for that exact moment his entire life. By the autumn of 1944, the European theater of operations had transformed from a war of movement into a grueling test of attrition and will. For First Sergeant Leonard Funk and the Red Devils of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the romanticism of the airborne soldier had long since been replaced by a grim, professional lethality. Two pivotal factors would converge to prepare Funk for his ultimate stand at Holzheim: the tactical mastery he displayed during Operation Market Garden and the profound moral shift caused by the Malmedy massacre. In September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history. The mission was audacious: to seize a series of bridges across the Rhine and end the war by Christmas. While the overall operation would eventually be remembered as a bridge too far, for Leonard Funk, it was another opportunity to demonstrate that numbers are often secondary to audacity. Near the town of Nijmegen, Funk observed a critical threat to the Allied mission. 3 German 20mm flak-Vierling anti-aircraft guns capable of shredding the thin-skinned gliders carrying reinforcements and supplies were entrenched on high ground. These guns were manned by approximately 20 German soldiers, protected by sandbags and interlocking fields of fire. Standard military doctrine dictates that an attacking force should maintain a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. Funk, accompanied by only 3 men, faced the inverse. He was outnumbered nearly 7-to-1. Disregarding the odds, Funk led a lightning assault on the position. With surgical precision, he and his 3 paratroopers neutralized the security detachment and silenced all 3 guns. This action ensured the safe landing of Allied gliders and earned Funk the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. He had proven that a small, determined force could paralyze a superior enemy through sheer aggression. However, the character of the war changed irrevocably on the 17th of December 1944. During the opening days of the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, a spearhead of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, led by Joachim Peiper, intercepted an American convoy at the Bognes crossroads near Malmedy. After a brief engagement, 113 Americans surrendered. They were disarmed and herded into a frozen field. In a blatant violation of the Geneva Convention and the unspoken codes of Western combat, the SS opened fire with machine guns. Those who survived the initial volleys were executed with pistol shots to the head as they lay in the snow. 84 American soldiers were murdered in cold blood. When news of the massacre filtered through the American lines, it acted as a chemical catalyst, hardening the resolve of every paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne. The rules of engagement had vanished. The massacre sent a clear, chilling message: Surrender was no longer a tactical option. It was a death sentence. For Leonard Funk, a man who had already seen the horrors of Normandy and Holland, Malmedy represented the death of chivalry. He internalized a solemn vow that he would never be led into a field to be shot like cattle. This psychological fortification would be the foundation of his reaction when a German officer pressed a submachine gun into his gut weeks later. The Siege of the Soul, the Ardennes Winter. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was the coldest in European memory. Temperatures plummeted to 5 degrees below zero, and the paratroopers of the 508th lived in a state of permanent frostbite. In the Ardennes, the environment was as much an enemy as the Wehrmacht. Men froze in their foxholes. Oil in weapons thickened into sludge. The very act of breathing was a struggle against the crystalline air. It was within this hellish landscape that Company C was ordered to take the village of Holzheim. The unit was decimated. Their executive officer had been killed, and many of the veterans were gone. Funk, now the acting executive officer, had to build a fighting force from the rear echelon, the cooks and clerks who had previously been spared the carnage of the front lines. He did not coddle them. He reminded them that they were paratroopers first. As they marched 15 miles through a driving blizzard toward Holzheim, Funk was not just leading a platoon. He was preparing them for a world where the enemy gave no quarter. He was a man who had earned the Silver Star for leadership and the Distinguished Service Cross for courage, but it was the ghost of Malmedy that truly guided his steps. By the time Funk reached the farmhouse at Holzheim, he was a weapon refined by 3 years of training, 3 combat jumps, and a singular, burning realization. In the face of a murderous enemy, the only rational response is an irrational level of defiance. The eruption of violence at the Holzheim farmhouse lasted less than a minute, but its echoes resonated through the halls of military history. When the last shell casing from Leonard Funk's Thompson submachine gun had cooled in the Belgian snow, the tactical reality was staggering. One man had neutralized a force that threatened to collapse an entire company's flank. Yet, for First Sergeant Funk, the conclusion of the battle was not the end of a story, but merely the completion of a task. On the 5th of September 1945, the war in Europe and the Pacific had finally ceased. Leonard Funk stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, a diminutive figure among the giants of the era. President Harry S. Truman, a veteran of the Great War himself, understood the weight of the Bronze Star suspended from the light blue ribbon. As he placed the Medal of Honor around Funk's neck, Truman's remark, "I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States," was not mere political hyperbole. It was an acknowledgement that while a president wields power through office, a man like Funk wields power through an internal, incorruptible fortitude. Funk's final tally of decorations was unparalleled. The Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. He was further honored by the liberated nations of Europe, receiving the French Croix de Guerre, the Belgian Order of Leopold, and the Dutch Military Order of William. He emerged from the conflict as the most decorated paratrooper of World War II, a titan of the 82nd Airborne Division. In the aftermath of global conflict, many heroes of Funk's stature pursued the limelight. They wrote memoirs, embarked on speaking tours, or sought political office, parlaying their wartime exploits into civilian influence. Leonard Funk chose a different path, one defined by the same quiet competence that had characterized his leadership in the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He returned to western Pennsylvania, the same industrial landscape that had forged his youth. Rather than cashing in on his fame, he returned to the world of service. For 27 years, he worked for the Veterans Administration, VA, in Pittsburgh. It was a poetic transition. The man who had led soldiers through the hedgerows of Normandy and the blizzards of the Ardennes now spent his days navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the government to ensure his fellow veterans received the benefits, health care, and respect they had earned. He rose to become the division chief of the Pittsburgh Regional Office, living a modest, middle-class life in McKeesport with his wife, Gertrude, and their 2 daughters. To his neighbors and colleagues, he was not a living legend. He was a diligent administrator, a devoted father, and a man who rarely, if ever, spoke of the war. When pressed about the events at Holzheim or the laughter that saved his life, his response remained a consistent, humble shrug. "I just did what I had to do." History often searches for complex meanings in the actions of heroes, but the legacy of Leonard Funk offers a simpler, more profound truth. His laughter at Holzheim was the ultimate expression of a free man's refusal to be intimidated. In a century defined by the rise of totalitarian machines and the cold mathematics of industrial warfare, Funk proved that the individual spirit remains the final, unpredictable variable. His story suggests that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of clarity. While the German officer was blinded by his own perceived power and the rigid structure of his orders, Funk remained observant. He saw the absurdity of the situation, the vulnerability of the victor, and the opportunity hidden within a crisis. He did not survive because he was the strongest or the loudest, but because he was the one who kept thinking when the world expected him to surrender. Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. passed away on the 20th of November, 1992, at the age of 76. He was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 35, grave 23734, among the rows of white headstones that mark the final resting places of America's most gallant. At the time of his death, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division of World War II. Today, his name is etched onto highways, post offices, and fitness centers, monuments to a man who never sought them. But his true monument is the lesson he left behind in the snow of Belgium. He reminds us that even when outnumbered 90-1, even with a gun pressed against the gut, the human spirit retains the capacity to laugh, to fight, and to prevail. Leonard Funk was the short, quiet paratrooper who became a giant, not through the weight of his medals, but through the unshakable strength of his character. In the traditional arc of military history, the climax of Leonard Funk's story is not merely a feat of arms, but a profound demonstration of the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, long before the term was coined. This fifth chapter examines the precise, kinetic mechanics of those 60 seconds in the Holzheim courtyard, a minute of high-stakes theater that transformed a potential massacre of Americans into a legendary triumph. As Funk rounded the corner of the farmhouse on that frozen afternoon of the 29th of January 1945, he stepped into a tactical vacuum. The 90 German soldiers present were not a disorganized rabble. They were a revitalized force, bolstered by a fresh patrol and rearmed with American and German weapons. The 4 American guards, stripped of their dignity and their gear, represented the total collapse of the local command structure. The German officer's decision to confront Funk personally was a move of psychological dominance. By shoving the MP-40 into Funk's midsection, the officer was attempting to finalize the surrender of the entire village. In the German tactical mind, capturing a first sergeant, the backbone of the American company, would break the remaining American morale. They expected the ritual of defeat, the raised hands, the bowed head, the whispered compliance. Instead, Leonard Funk introduced a variable the German military manual did not cover: derisive, unstoppable laughter. In historical military psychology, laughter in the face of death is often categorized as a disruptive cognitive shock. By laughing, Funk shattered the German officer's script. The officer's red-faced rage was a symptom of his loss of control. He was shouting commands that were being met not with fear, but with ridicule. This 60-second window of confusion was the only terrain Funk had left to maneuver in. While his chest heaved with laughter, Funk's internal focus was singular. He was measuring the distance between his hand and the grip of his M1A1 Thompson, calculating the tension in the officer's trigger finger, and waiting for the exact moment the officer's eyes flickered with uncertainty. The transition from laughter to lethality was instantaneous. The official Medal of Honor citation describes it as a lightning motion. Funk utilized the sling arms position of his submachine gun to his advantage. As he feigned the motion of unslinging the weapon to hand it over, he used the momentum of the heavy .45 caliber firearm to swing the muzzle downward in a tight, violent arc. The Thompson submachine gun, often called the Chicago typewriter, was a devastating tool in close-quarters battle. When Funk pulled the trigger, the recoil was managed by his sheer willpower and muscle memory. The first burst did not just kill the German officer. It served as a signal flare for the 4 American guards. As Funk pivoted, spraying the courtyard with 230-grain slugs, the 4 guards recognized the shift in the tides of fate. They did not wait for orders. They lunged for the pile of discarded rifles. The Germans, who a moment ago were the masters of the farm, suddenly found themselves in a kill zone created by a single man. The snow, once a pristine white, was churned into a slush of mud and crimson. By the time Funk slammed his second 30-round magazine into the Thompson, the psychological collapse of the German force was complete. They had witnessed a man laugh at a gun in his gut, and then systematically dismantle an entire platoon. To the German survivors, Funk appeared less like a soldier and more like an elemental force of nature. When the firing stopped, 21 Germans lay dead. The wounded groaned in the biting cold, and the remaining 60-plus soldiers who theoretically still held a massive numerical advantage threw down their weapons in a state of total shock. Funk's subsequent remark, "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen," was a critique of the German failure to secure their perimeter and a dismissal of his own near-death experience. He treated the miracle at Holzheim with the same professional detachment he used when filing supply reports. The Holzheim action was the definitive proof that the American paratrooper was a different breed of warrior. Funk's ability to improvise a victory out of a total catastrophe became a case study in leadership. On the 5th of September 1945, when the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck, it was an acknowledgement that Leonard Funk Jr. had mastered the most difficult skill in warfare: the ability to remain a thinking human being when the world had descended into madness. He left the Army as the most decorated paratrooper in American history, carrying the weight of the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Silver Star. Yet, the man who laughed at 90 Germans spent the rest of his life in quiet service, a testament to the fact that the greatest heroes are often those who feel no need to remind the world of their greatness. The annals of military history are often populated by figures who, upon the cessation of hostilities, leverage their battlefield renown into the currency of public life. Many Medal of Honor recipients of the Second World War became household names, their exploits immortalized by Hollywood or utilized as springboards for political dynasties. Yet, First Sergeant Leonard Funk Jr., the most decorated paratrooper of the global conflict, chose a path that was perhaps his most heroic act of all: a return to the profound, dignified silence of the American working class. Following the formal surrender of the Axis powers, the United States began the monumental task of demobilization. For Funk, the transition from the elite vanguard of the 82nd Airborne to civilian life in western Pennsylvania was handled with the same quiet competence that had defined his leadership in the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He did not seek the spotlight, he did not author a sensationalized memoir, nor did he join the lucrative lecture circuit. Instead, the man who had stared down 90 Germans at Holzheim returned to his roots near Pittsburgh and sought employment that would allow him to continue serving his fellow man without fanfare. He accepted a position with the Veterans Administration (VA), a role that brought his career full circle. For the next 27 years, Leonard Funk occupied a desk at the VA, navigating the dense thicket of government bureaucracy to secure disability claims, pensions, and medical benefits for his fellow veterans. He rose through the ranks to become the division chief of the Pittsburgh Regional Office, not through political maneuvering, but through the steady, reliable labor that had always been his hallmark. Funk settled in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, a community defined by its proximity to the steel mills and its residents' unwavering work ethic. To his neighbors, he was not the slayer of Holzheim or the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. He was Leonard, a devoted husband to his wife, Gertrude, and a steady father. Before the war, Funk had been a store clerk. After the war, he became a different kind of clerk, a champion for those who had sacrificed, as he had, to their 2 daughters. The physical evidence of his heroism, the Medal of Honor, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the numerous foreign decorations from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, was kept without ostentation. He rarely spoke of the war, and even when specifically asked about the laughing incident that saved his life, he remained a man of few words. He viewed his service not as a point of pride, but as a completed duty. This humility stands in stark contrast to the modern era of celebrity, reflecting a generation of men who believed that the reward for doing one's duty was simply the ability to return to a life of peace. On the 20th of November 1992, at the age of 76, Leonard Funk Jr. succumbed to cancer in Braddock Hills, Pennsylvania. His passing marked the end of an era. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division to have served in World War II. He was interred with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, taking his place in Section 35, Grave 23734. Even in death, he remained among his peers the thousands of silent sentinels who represent the cost of freedom. In the decades following his death, the nation slowly began to formally recognize the magnitude of his legacy. A fitness center at Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, a highway in Pennsylvania, and a post office in McKeesport were dedicated in his name. Yet, Despite these honors, Funk remains a soldier's soldier, a figure revered by historians and paratroopers, but largely unknown to the general public compared to names like Audie Murphy or Alvin York. The story of Leonard Funk Jr. challenges the conventional American archetype of the warrior. He was not a man of imposing stature or reckless bravado. He was a 5'5" clerk who proved that the most potent weapon on the battlefield is a clear, calculating mind. At Holzheim, the mathematics of survival were zero, but Funk understood that war is not merely a contest of numbers, it is a contest of wills. His laughter in the face of a German submachine gun remains one of the most remarkable instances of psychological warfare in military history. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated defiance that proved a single individual armed with nothing but a Thompson and an iron resolve could alter the course of an engagement. President Truman's assertion that he would rather have the Medal of Honor than be president remains the ultimate tribute to Funk. It was an admission that while a president may command armies, he cannot command the specific, lightning-fast courage required to laugh when death is inches away. Leonard Funk Jr. was a man who lived his life with a quiet intensity, proving that true greatness does not require a loud voice, but rather a steady hand and a heart that refuses to surrender. The story of Leonard Funk Jr. challenges us to look beyond the cold statistics of war. It is easy to study maps and maneuvers, but far harder to measure the heart of a man who chooses to laugh when the math says he is already dead. Leonard Funk proved that courage isn't about your stature, it's about your resolve when the muzzle is at your stomach. If this story of the most decorated paratrooper moved you, please like and share to ensure his name is never forgotten. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the lives of the silent heroes who shaped our world. Who is a forgotten hero you think we should cover next? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay vigilant and stay brave.